Thank you all for coming to this talk of Professor Gunning. This talk is part of the Intelligence of Cinema collaboration project between the U and the Calarts Center around the films and the thought of Jean Epstein. So I want to thank first the Institute of Advanced Study, which is graciously sponsoring Tom Gunning's visit and hosting this talk, as well as the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature, the Department of Art, and the Department of French and Italian. Special thanks go to Graham Stout, the many-headed one, ever present in organizing this month-long series and coordinating visitors and events between two institutions, the Walker and the U. So, great job. Next Tuesday, we will host Sarah Keller in Nicholson for her talk titled Cinema, Nostalgia, and the Apocalypse. I think it's at 3 p.m.
5 p.m.
5 p.m., there you go. Over the next 2 Wednesdays, we will also screen more Epstein films at the Walker, actually 2 full features and 4 shorts. And so check the calendar for, it's at 7:30, check the calendar for the films themselves. Jean Epstein was a forgotten giant of cinema and film theory in the US until Tom Gunning spearheaded and Sarah Keller and Jason Paul, who happens to be here in the back, the tall guy, organized a conference in Chicago in 2007. It led to the first collection of essays in English on Jean Epstein, as well as, and it was also germinal for my own book on Jean Epstein. French film historians and institutions have been slow at embracing Epstein for complicated reasons. The 2007 conference in Chicago made enough waves that crossed the Atlantic, I guess, by way of the Great Lakes, to trigger last year a republishing of the entire collected writings of Jean Epstein, which will be over 5 volumes and about 2,000 pages. He's written over 15 books. And also led to the re-edition of, or actually the edition, because they never come out in available formats. So now there's an 18 film box set from Potemkin showing a range of Epstein's films. So Professor Gunning was absolutely the catalyst in the renewal of Jean Epstein studies, both in the US and I think also in France and in Europe. Tom Gunning is Edward A. and Betty L. Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the Department of Art History and Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. For most of you, Professor Gunning will need a little introduction since, like me, your understanding of cinema as in its historical, cultural, modernist, and perceptual dimensions has been in a substantial way shaped by his work. Particularly the influential concept, and we were just talking about a minute ago, of the cinema of attractions, that opened up film studies to interactions between the apparatus and the embodiment of perceivers, among other things. Professor Gunning was at the forefront of several views of cinema we now take for granted, that it should be regarded as essentially porous, or rather than autonomous, as essentially porous rather than autonomous, to other cultural domains such as art, literature, mass or even trash culture. Also that affixing national boundaries to the study of cinema is plainly historically distortive and unduly reductive. Also that cinema exemplifies interplay of techniques and aesthetics that are broader and in some ways older than cinema. The range and depth of his expertise and cinephilia is legendary, from early and silent cinema to more recent avant-garde, from historiography to auteur theory, from Griffith to French and Japanese cinema, and the entire optical and visual cultures of modernism. While he has written important monographs on D.W. Griffith and Fritz Lang, Professor Gunning is a deeply dialogical scholar with numerous collaborations, co-edited projects, collective essays, and major colloquia and exhibitions. Even his sole authored articles, over 100, seem to me open directly to conversations, reciprocal interrogations, shared scrutiny and curiosity, and occasionally polemics, which he approaches as fertile jousting rather than ego assault. His latest projects are indeed collaboratives, a book with Giovanna Fossati, which is titled Fantasia of Colors in Early Cinema, University of Amsterdam Press 2015. And he has been at work on a play with Travis Preston entitled Fantômas, Revenge of the Image, at the Calarts Center for New Performance in Southern California. So both of those are collaborations. I will add that speaking to other former students of Tom Gunning along the years, and from my own experience, that I believe Tom is one of the most generous scholars that I know. The title of his talk is Ghostly Ontologies, the Haunted Image in Friedrich, Murnau, and Epstein. Tom Gunning.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, actually, after hearing that, I think I should go home. But thank you. I really, it's one thing to hear nice things about yourself, but it's even better when they're exactly the ones you'd like to hear. So, and I want to thank everyone for bringing me here, and also thank Graham for helping me put this together technically. So, just a brief word. I've been working a bit on Nosferatu just very recently, and then was thinking about this and thinking about how the ideas that I was coming up with about Murnau were so relevant also to Jean Epstein. So I kind of did a mashup here, and I think it works. Although this is absolutely the first time I've delivered it, so and hopefully not the last. So it's also, I have to say, seasonal. I knew we were coming close to Halloween, so some of this is also meant to just be Halloween entertainment. So my favorite holiday is just around the corner. Halloween, when the dead return and feast with us. Their return to our earth disturbs our sense of rigid categories. We, the living, mask up and put on strange costumes, so that when the dead walk among us, they may not be recognizable and can move about freely. Like all true holidays that mark our movement from the everyday into a sort of sacred time, it makes us aware of the permeable nature of thresholds and boundaries, and of things that dwell there between, say, the living and the dead, or perhaps the imaginary and the real, ghosts, vampires, mirror reflections, works of art. So let me begin by reading to you a story. Just curl up. From America's greatest dweller on that threshold. One of those American figures that it took the French to fully appreciate, Edgar Poe. And it's his story, The Oval Portrait. I'm going to read you the core of it. It's not the complete narrative. Sorry. Yes. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art. She, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as a young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art, which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the continence of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber where the light dripped onto the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day. And he was a passionate, wild, and moody man who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see that the light which fell so ghastly in the lone turret withered the health and spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on, and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who loved him so, and yet who daily grew dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none unto the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from canvas rarely, even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread on the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little remained to be done, save one brush upon the mouth, and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of a lamp. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before that work that he had wrought. But in the next, while yet he gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying out with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. So what is this brief tale about? Relations between man and woman, husband and wife, artist and model, the image and the reality, life itself and its portrait. Is it not, in fact, a vampire tale? Now, Jean Epstein, like Charles Baudelaire, Stéphane Mallarmé, Paul Valéry, and Jean Godard, who tells the same story in his film Vivre sa vie, was a lover of Poe. And one of Epstein's masterpieces, A Chute de la Maison Usher, not only offered a cinematic version of Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, but blended this tale with the oval portrait and identified Roderick Usher with that painter protagonist. But I also find in Fall of the House of Usher, La Chute de Maison Usher, echoes of another film. And very near the beginning, and I'm going to show you several clips, but this one I realized I can summarize and didn't need to take the time. The narrator of Poe's tale, in a scene that's not in Poe's story, comes to a tavern and asks for a carriage to take him to the house of Usher. And immediately everybody in the tavern goes, "Usher, Usher," and looks alarmed. And it's a scene that is very much copied from a similar scene in Nosferatu from 1922, Fall of the House of Usher, which was made in 1929, by Friedrich Murnau, in which, here taken from Dracula, the source, by Bram Stoker of the novel, the hero named Hutter comes into a tavern, asks for a carriage to Dracula's castle, and everybody goes, "Dracula," or actually they call him Orlok in that film. So this parallel is always striking to me. And in fact, scenes like this, you've seen them probably, they become a kind of staple of later horror films. Not only the various versions of Dracula, which you'll have a scene like this, but also things like American Werewolf in London, or Polanski's The Fearless Vampire Killers, where travelers announce their destination in a tavern or bar and get a horrified reaction, and usually a severe warning from the local inhabitants. But here, I think Epstein in Fall of the House of Usher is referencing not just a moment from a kind of genre, but a moment and a film that was important in the evolution of film art. An evolution that Epstein himself helped to define. These two films, Nosferatu in 1922 and Fall of the House of Usher in 1929, bookend what is arguably the most extraordinary decade in the history of film, the 1920s. Now, it's during this decade that cinema actually defined itself as an art, starting, I would claim, with, from 1920, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and ending the decade with such films as Andalusian Dog, or Eisenstein's General Line, or Veritas Man with the Movie Camera, all from 1929. Now, these films not only explored the medium of film self-consciously, but also departed from traditions of narrative verisimilitude, which had developed during the 19-teens. So they were also deviant films in a certain way. That's quite important. And I am claiming that they were also kind of theoretical works. They attempted to define the nature of the film image. In other words, its ontology. Okay, now the issue of ontology in the cinema, the nature of the being of the cinematic image, has been dominated by an extraordinary essay by André Gaudreault, The Ontology of the Photographic Image. And there's Bazin with his kitty. Bazin is usually approached as a realist, and indeed that is how he would have described himself. But his realism and his idea of cinematic realism was expansive. And I've always felt that it was greatly in debt to the thought of Jean Epstein, although this is largely unacknowledged in Bazin's work, and perhaps, I think, even repressed. But that's an issue for further discussion some other time. Although film's photographic nature served as the cornerstone of Bazin's realist theory, the essay is actually the ontology of the photographic image, although he's going to apply it to film. It's easy, I think, for readers to miss the dialectical nature of Bazin's conception of the photographic image. So, what I'm going to emphasize here is that as much as its realism, it was photography's uncanny aspect that fascinated Bazin, what he referred to quote him directly, as the irrational power of the photograph to bear away our faith, unquote. He even claimed, again quoting, photography ranks high in the order of surrealist creativity because it produces an image that is a reality of nature, but a hallucination that is also a fact. Now, I'm going to term this less often stressed aspect of Bazin's view of photography his ghostly ontology, which indicates its relation of the realism of the photographic image, not only to the realist mission of referring to the world, but also to these unsettling effects that I think photography can have. For Bazin, the photographic image complicated our very concept of presence. And I'm going to give you a quote here. This is from Bazin. It's no longer as certain as it once was that there is no middle ground between presence and absence. It is false to say that the screen is incapable of putting us in the presence of the actor. It does so in the same way as a mirror. One must agree that a mirror relays the presence of the person reflected in it. But it is a mirror with a delayed reflection. The tin foil, actually I think it's a bad translation, the tane of which retains the image. End of quote. So with this zone between absence and presence, and the retained image of a mirror with a memory, Bazin redefines the ontology of presence by attributing it to an image. The photograph, and even more the temporal image of the cinema, or the mirror, delivers images that retain some sense of living presence, even as they exist removed spatially or temporally from our direct experience. The image, it would seem Bazin is claiming, is present, but it is not necessarily either here or now. This defines what I'm talking about as ghostly ontology, a virtual image existing within a belated time. It might find its perfect and paradoxical emblem in the undead vampire, who in Murnau's film defies tradition, and as we'll see at the end of this talk, becomes reflected in a mirror at the point of his death. Even more, it appears in Epstein's paradoxical cinematic portrayal of Poe's oval portrait. Now, Bazin, like most French film critics, including Epstein, considered that the Count of Dr. Caligari, even though it initiated this kind of ambition of film as an art form, was a misstep in the evolution of film art. Basically because of its distorted theatrical sets. However, Bazin repeatedly indicated his admiration for another classic of Weimar uncanny cinema, precisely Murnau's Nosferatu. Quoting from Bazin, Nosferatu plays for the greater part of the time against natural settings, whereas the fantastic qualities of Caligari were derived from deformations of lighting and decor. And this is actually a shot from Nosferatu, to which a later film historian has actually annotated the real locations in Slovakia where it was shot. So he's filming this horror film not in a stylized set, but in a real location. Now, I will claim that Nosferatu uses realist aspects in order to create a sense of ghostly ontology, using its vampire protagonist and his shadowy nature to say something about the nature of the cinematic image. A sequence towards the middle of Nosferatu helps me define this film's uncanny realism. Okay, now I've got to switch here to my other medium. Just take this back a little bit. Start with the intertitle. So this is from, now how do I take that? This is about the middle, in fact very close to the exact middle of the film, in which Professor Bulwer, a Paracelsian, is giving a little kind of science lecture. And actually one of the things that's interesting is this just kind of interrupts the vampire story for a commentary. So we see Bulwer's study. The professor stands on a little platform with his students around him. They edge a little closer. And we cut to this extreme close-up of a Venus flytrap as it closes around a fly, entrapping it. Then we see Bulwer smiling grimly, like a vampire. Is it not? Back to the long shot. And then we have this brief interruption where we move to this lunatic, Knock. It's the character Renfield in Stoker's novel, the other Dracula films, who's in an insane asylum. And so we've interrupted the demonstration for this little slice of narrative. And he's eating flies. And although he interrupts the demonstration, obviously the cut is associative. He's like the Venus flyplant. Her human version. Then we go back to Bulwer's demonstration as he leans over this aquarium, tells the students to come closer. And then, after this title, we see this microscopic image of a polyp with tentacles. And then in the extreme close-up, we see it grab at this prey. And this is important. Transparent. The German actually is almost bodiless. So like a little practic knock, looking at spiders. So you can see the connection, these scientific images of the actual processes of nature and its more horrific aspects. Is there a way to, it's back in full screen, I'm sorry, here. The thing that I thought would, well, here, wait, I've got to move, I guess. Okay. So this lecture demonstration actually resembles the scientific films of this era, which often presented microscopic displays of the secrets of nature. The first successful series of this genre was done by Charles Urban in about 1906 and continued through the teens, and it was called The Unseen World. That Murnau incorporated such scientific footage into a horror film makes clear why Bazin admired Nosferatu. It accords with the realist but also uncanny aspects of Bazin's ghostly ontology. At the center of Nosferatu's realism lies not only the objective, but the unsettling. Cinema's realist imagery supports rather than undermines this vampire tale. We can take Bulwer's final comment on his microscopic image of the polyp as an indication, in fact, of the uncanny cinema itself. Transparent, almost bodiless. The very conditions of film's visibility, a transparent image projected by light, makes it seem immaterial, or as Bulwer says, almost a phantom. Bulwer's demonstration not only reveals the structure of nature, but also accents cinema's ghostly images. Now, a double path brought Jean Epstein to cinema. His interest in science and his training in medicine on the one hand, and on the other, his devotion to poetry, particularly modern poetry. His first film, in fact, was a scientific film about Louis Pasteur. Epstein, as a theorist, saw the cinema as an apparatus that could blend scientific and poetic views of the world, revealing their common sources. His philosophy of lyrosophy wished to return to science, the passion it had banished in the name of objectivity, and to find in the scientific experiment the basis of a new lyricism. Thus, in one of his central essays, The Cinematograph Viewed from Etna, published in 1926, Epstein described the impact of scientific films in his poetic prose. In front of me at Nancy, a room with 300 people moaned when they saw a grain of wheat germinate on the screen. Suddenly, the true visage of life and death, of a terrifying love, appeared, provoking these religious outcries. What churches, if we only knew how to construct them, could accommodate a spectacle like this, where life itself is revealed? To discover unexpectedly, as if for the first time, everything from a divine perspective, but with its symbolic profile and vaster sense of analogy, suffused with the aura of personal identity. That is the great joy of cinema. In water, crystals as beautiful as Venus grow, born as she was, replete with the most elusive symmetries, correspondences, and charms. A heavenly game. Thus do worlds fall. Where from? Into a space of light. In order to grow and unite, rocks make beautifully steady gestures, as if they were meeting beloved memories. Under the sea, angelfish and those voluptuous organs, the secretive jellyfish dance. Insects appear as large as battleships, as cruel as intellect and devour each other. This power of the scientific film extended to all of cinema in being able not only to enlarge our views of the world, to reveal through the manipulations of time and image its hidden structures. End of quote. The world thus revealed, Epstein claimed, was supernatural. The ancient world of archaic cultures, alive with spirits and ghosts, was revived by cinema. Quoting him again, "One of the greatest powers of cinema is its animism. Nature is never inanimate. Objects take on airs. Trees gesticulate. Mountains, just like Etna, convey meanings. Every prop becomes a character. The sets are cut to pieces, and each fragment assumes a distinctive expression. An astonishing pantheism is born in the world and fills it until it bursts. The grass in the meadow is a smiling, feminine genie. Anemones, full of rhythm and personality, evolve with the majesty of planets." Okay, so I want to bring these two visions together, and I would say one could summarize Bulwer's lesson as claiming that the evil of the vampire lurks at the center of nature, at nature's processes of nourishment, and that the scientific film can reveal this hidden power for all to see. Epstein develops even further the sense that the uncanny revelations of cinema and its scientific objectivity are profoundly interwoven. But by the late 20s, for Epstein, a whole new realm of cinematic technique had opened up, what he called photogeny. In Epstein's films, the disorienting power of the close-up and camera movement superseded Murnau's carefully structured, deep compositions and use of parallel editing to bring us closer and into more movement. Now, at the same time though, I think this sense of the natural and the realist is also in Murnau, even if the techniques have changed. The natural locations that Bazin praised in Nosferatu also contributed to the film's ghostly ontology. Its conviction that in its very nature, the world is haunted, and that cinema can reveal this. Many of these landscapes that appear in the film remain bereft of human figures, distant views, not made accessible by pathways or roads. They do not invite us, even as spectators, to enter them, but rather reveal distant, forbidding horizons. These shots rarely serve as establishing shots that introduce locations in which the narrative action takes place. Instead of containing action, they possess an autonomy, an isolation, conveying a sense of atmosphere, or, to use the even more appropriate German term, Stimmung. Indeed, these landscapes evoke an unseen power beyond the human. The shots that appear in the film of prowling hyena and frightened horses evoke an eerie surrounding wilderness. And landscape also gives the film an essential rhythm, marking transitions from day to night. This image of the setting sun. The triumph of darkness over light that determines the power of the vampire. Now, Epstein's key cinematic concept, photogeny, this power that the camera had to reveal the structures of nature, could also be described as an attempt to render Stimmung through cinema, although perhaps the term atmosphere is better. Understood almost literally as a sort of emanation from a landscape, a vapor that fills and enlivens the space between earth and sky. Atmosphere surrounds the house of Usher. Beyond misty, soft-focused photography, Epstein portrays the atmosphere of the house of Usher as a realm of constant vibration, as if an inaudible sound lifts off the surface of things and resounds through the air. Epstein related cinema's ability to convey this intangible energy to primitive animisms we've seen. The sense that everything is sentient, everything is alive and filled with soul, and the cinema reveals this. Poe, in his story, described the House of Usher as almost a living thing. One, however, that ironically is in the process of disintegration and dying. Slow motion and camera movement in Epstein's film endow objects within the Maison Usher with that tense vitality, like the strings of this guitar, always on the verge of snapping and of things collapsing. Now, in Nosferatu, where we have this wider view of landscapes, there is an image that particularly fascinates me, and it is this one. And it appears in the sequence in which Hutter, the protagonist, Harker from Stoker's novel, cowers in his bedroom at the nocturnal approach of the equivalent of Dracula, Orlok, the vampire. Frightened by the sight of the vampire standing rigid in his parlor, Hutter rushes to a recess in his bedroom, perhaps seeking a means of escape. There's a window there. This image of a waterfall appears, one of the most forbidding landscapes in the film. Bereft of clear markers of perspective or viewpoint, it's even hard to figure out its location or angle of view. One feels this view less as the object of Hutter's glance than as blocking his field of vision, as well as his means of escape. This unnavigable view of nature seems to stare back at him blankly. Okay, now I've got to add this. It's a little Rorschach. I see a skull there. The problem is that I see it in some prints and not in others, or at least more strongly. But even if you don't see that, the other things I said I think are true. So it's creepy. In the second half of Nosferatu, these mountain landscapes give way to images of the sea as their associations shift from Hutter to his wife, Ellen, who is waiting his return. Most commentators on Nosferatu have discussed the ambiguity of Ellen's connection to the vampire, which is mainly conveyed by parallel editing from Hutter with the vampire back to Ellen at home, and particularly this image where we cut from Orlok about to bite Hutter to Ellen back in Wiesborg calling out to him, her arms outstretched. And the cutting in the scene makes a connection by the gestures across distant spaces. But it seems also ambiguous in this object. Is it Hutter or the vampire that Ellen is calling out to and reaching out to? And in intention, does Ellen await the return of Hutter or the advent of Orlok? Is she protecting her husband or falling under the erotic sway of the vampire? Shots of the ocean sustain and intensify this ambivalent attraction. Hutter returns by land, while it is Orlok that comes by sea. As Ellen waits by the shore, we see the first image of the ocean, its surf coming to the shore rather placidly. And then in the following shot, which is the one we have here, the sea forms the background to an image of Ellen seated by the shore among the crosses of the seaside cemetery. But in the following shots, the ocean surf becomes associated with the vampire who is traveling on a ship. These waves increase in violence after Orlok has killed off the captain and the mates of his ship, the Empusa. An extraordinary sequence intercuts Ellen trance-like on her balcony, her arms outstretched, as we see Hutter proceeding by land and the ghost ship, its sails full of wind, and images of the sun sinking into the sea horizons as the surf pounds on the shore. I'm going to show you some of this sequence. She has just announced, I must go to him. He is coming. Sorry. Next sequence. That's just a preview. Sorry for that. Okay. Helen's words, which came just before the sequence we saw, I must go to him, he comes, reflect the ambiguity of her desire. Which he will she meet? The interplay of images expresses a natural and sinister force approaching, carried by forces of nature and its cycles. The mini symphony of horror that we see there identifies the sinister power of Orlok with the processes of nature, the wind and the surf. The realism that Bazin valued in Murnau therefore asserts more than objectivity or documentary accuracy. Murnau's ghostly ontology, like Epstein's photogene, endows the very realism of the cinema image with a kind of supernatural power. Now, Murnau also associates another aspect of cinema with the vampire's power, the mechanics of cinematic motion. In shots throughout the film, the vampire seems to control the very process of the moving image, violating its naturalism by altering the rate of filming and movement. Most famously, the coach that Orlok sends to convey Hutter to his castle moves at an accelerated speed. It's in fast motion. And although this sometimes in classes provokes laughter among viewers who haven't sufficiently gotten under the spell of the film, this uncanny motion, I think, delivers cinema's moving image over to the vampire's control. Similar under cranking, it creates fast motion, produces the speedy animation of Hutter's view of Orlok loading his earth-filled coffins onto a wagon, even causing the coffin lid to magically cover him after he's climbed in. But Murnau, therefore, identifies Orlok with the aspect of cinema itself, not just its realism, but its nature, willing even to introduce the tricks of cinematography that Bazin generally felt uncomfortable with. Perhaps the most marked reference to the technology of cinema comes after Hutter has crossed the bridge on the border of Orlok's realm, and it marks his entrance into the land of the phantoms. Hutter now encounters the uncanny sense of vision, unheimlich as the title calls it. The first of these visual enchantments is that eerily speeded up carriage that transports him to the land of visions. But once he climbs in, the carriage moves off at the supernatural and shaky speed, and Murnau gives us an image of the carriage moving through the forest in negative, which we see here. This inversion of tone as the dark carriage moves through a forest of white foliage creates a truly haunting image. But it also makes us aware of the process by which photographs are made, the production of a negative that reacts to the light and registers not that familiar image that the positive print shows us, but a reversal of values as if seen through a glass darkly. Cinema, which is a photographic image that suddenly begins to move and come to life, may represent a triumph of realism, fulfilling an ancient desire for lifelike illusion that Bazin described. But it also could summon up a nightmare scenario, that terrifying coming to life of an inanimate object or figure that horror stories have told in endless variation. Nosferatu, the film, begins by invoking a particular inversion of this coming to life story. And I'm going to show you the German title here. I'll give you some translation, but those of you in that German will be able to get the full sense. Nosferatu begins with this intertitle, which tells the viewer never to say the word Nosferatu, which of course if you're reading it, maybe you're already in trouble. Or, if you do say it, the images, to quote, translate here, the images of life will fade to shadows, and haunting dreams will climb forth from your heart and feed on your blood. Rather than coming to life, the invocation of the vampire makes living images pale and become shadows, shadows that suck the blood like a vampire. I think it's a perfect description of that phantom chariot that brings Hunter to Orlok, a lifelike, positive image that has faded away and become shadow-like. And of course, it is the central action of the story I told you, Poe's oval portrait. Only here the vampiric effect comes from the artist or the art process itself. Art students be warned. At the center of La Chute de la Maison Usher, Epstein stages the drama of the oval portrait. Roderick Usher insists on painting a portrait of his wife, Madeline. As in Poe's tale, this process drains Madeline of vitality and eventually of life itself. And now I'm going to show you a somewhat extended sequence from Epstein's film. Epstein uses all the devices of photogenet in the sequence. Extreme close-ups, rhythmic editing, superimposition. I want you to notice this use of superimposition very carefully. You can see the negative. Frozen as a kind of sculpture. As the portrait gains life, Epstein uses the melting candles to visualize the flickering light of her mortality, with the rivulets of fluid wax paralleling her loss of energy. And I should also say Usher's huge enlarged face and hands moving through the frame in close-up assert his male dominance and egotistic blindness. And that first intimation of Madeline's death is portrayed by multiple layers of superimposition, as if the very coherence of her figure were separating into diverse strands. See this sense of obsession. He expresses briefly some concern for his wife, but the painting comes out. This is the narrator who is visiting Usher and his wife, and we'd gone out for a walk and is coming back in this kind of inopportune moment. As Usher convinces his wife to resume sitting for the portrait. Now, if you look quickly, you can see that portrait is not a portrait. It's not only a photograph, it blinks its eyes. As the real Madeline in slow motion, which was for Epstein in this late period, the essence of photogenet, collapses. camera movement, which we'll see even more extraordinary in just a minute. Enlivening, changing, transforming what we're seeing. And here the phrase from Poe. In truth, it is life itself. As I mentioned, the moment of intimations of her mortality, of her death, come partly with these superpositions, this kind of multiplying of her image, which, as I mentioned, also goes into negative and into a kind of sculptural relief. All of this seems to undo the realism of the photographic image, or at least its vitality. If the familiar photographic image represents the positivist realist side to Bazan's ontology, what's usually noted, we might claim that the shadow, the superposition, the negative are emblems of what I'm calling ghostly ontology. Okay. Coming back to Nosferatu, Murnau's play of shadows finds its climax at the end of the film, as Ellen, actually by herself, destroys Orlok. Perhaps the most enduring image of the film, often quoted, comes as Orlok mounts the stairs to keep a rendezvous that Ellen has made with him and approaches her door. He arrives as a shadow, cast on the wall, enlarged and elongated, as if the shadow had overwhelmed his physical body and gained a life of its own. The palpable power of the shadow reaches its climax, and I'll show you this in just a second, as Ellen cowers in her bed, waiting for his arrival, and his shadow hand gropes towards her. The vampire shadow moves caressingly across Ellen's nightgown, screen, until it reaches her breast and squeezes. She reacts in pain or ecstasy, I think pain. That the shadow has gained the physical power to be able to physically grasp, declares its supernatural rather than just its visual energy. So we're now going to look at the end of Nosferatu. She sent her husband to go get Dr. Bulwer, who of course in Stoker's version, in Van Helsing, is the person who destroys Dracula. But in Murnau's version, he's just a doddering old man, just like the husband. They don't even get there in time, as you'll see. it's her who saves us. So the ending of this film is well known. Orlok kneels by Ellen's bed, his head and mouth resting in the crook of her neck. See here briefly, not reacting to the destruction of his master, Dracula. But I'd like to point out that Orlok's feeding with the absorption of a baby at a breast pulls together sexual satisfaction, nurture, and death in a deeply primitive mix. This conjunction of the maternal and the deathly, of the vampire draining elements of her lifeblood, while she in turn entraps him through the natural cycle of light and darkness that destroys him, recalls the images that Bleuer presented, in which the process of feeding destroys the victim. The cut to the crowing cock causes the vampire to lift his head in the realization of the trap into which he has fallen as he slowly turns toward the sound of the breaking dawn. And here the sluggard doctor has been the only hurrying. See the dawn at the window. Deadly light. Orlok rises, his standing figure now clearly caught in the mirror as he crosses towards the window. He completes a delicate ballet of hand gestures. Just look at it, so beautifully worked out. And then pirouettes before the window, filled with the dawning light that rids his figure. He turns his face to the glare of his own demise, and then quickly fades away, and only a pile of smoking ashes remains. Now, students are always anxious to point out that Orlok's brief appearance in the mirror violates the cardinal rule of vampire lore, at least according to Stoker, that vampires cast no reflection. The doubling of the vampire, though, I think, prior to his death, possesses a visual logic that goes to the core of a ghostly ontology. Nosferatu exists as an image. His creepy ontology between the living and the dead corresponds to Murnau to a visual portrayal in which the image has both power and vulnerability. The final inner title, in fact, of Nosferatu compares the destruction of the vampire to, quote, the triumphant rays of the living sun obliterating the shadow of the bird of death, unquote. Shadows and reflections derive their power from a direct connection to life and light. But Murnau also asserts that they remain mere images, immaterial, insubstantial, bodiless. Shadows might be able to seize a breast, but bodies can also fade away into nothing. Nosferatu contemplates not only the nature of desire and its relation to death, the ambiguous power of nourishment, and the destruction at the heart of nature, but also cinema's power as a projected photographic moving image that can present all of this to us. La Chute de Maison Lesher moves its contemplation of the uncanny power of images ever closer to the theoretical exploration of the nature of the image, both moving and still, painted and living. Madeline dies so that her image might live. Epstein transforms Poe's horrific return of Madeline from the grave into a sort of happy ending, as the husband and wife reunite and the pestilent house and its vapors catch fire and sink into the tarn. But even this hint of redemption offered by this ending does not seem to palliate the power of this cautionary tale. The cinema may not only be like a vampire, as Stein seems to say, it might be a vampire. Making lifelike images might sap a living being of its energy. Thus, Murnau and Epstein contemplate the nature of the cinema through their filmmaking, creating moving images filled with light, seemingly alive, they also register the uncanny aspects of cinema's apparent realism, its shadowy side. It recalls for me a phrase that I found recently in reading a pulp novel by a French science fiction writer of the 19-teens, a man named Gustave Le Rouge, who was a close friend, in fact, of Epstein's mentor, the great French poet Blaise Cendrars. Le Rouge says, "Playing with phantoms, one risks becoming one." So, happy Halloween. I presume we have time for questions if people have any. Take a minute, and people who have to leave or want to leave can leave, and people who have questions can formulate them. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was a really great talk. Now I'm definitely seeing Epstein in a whole new way through all of these female superimpositions. They're fascinating. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why you're defining the idea of the ghostly or uncanny in relation to the ontology of the photographic image. I mean, you talk about animism and animation and dead or inanimate things coming to life in a variety of ways. So I guess the kind of general version of the question would be, what do you do with animation? What do you do with stop motion animation in relation to this idea of ghostly ontologies? And a more precise version of the question would be something like, to what extent are you arguing that the ghostly or the uncanny in cinema fundamentally is located in a cinema that's invested in defining or representing its own idea of ontology, like which is Epstein's cinema, this interwar art cinema. It's a form or movement in cinema that's obsessed with defining its own ontology, its own idea of ontology, the ontology of being, the ontology of the medium. Is this discourse of film ontology the primary location of how you're defining the ghostly or uncanny?
Well, I guess what I would say is I'm, in this talk, only trying to define the ghostly ontology of cinema. Is there another kind of ghostly ontology, which I guess is partly what you're asking me? I guess I would rather hold off making a definite statement about that. Because I'm not sure it would be an ontology. Lurking behind all of this, of course, is the concept of the unheimlich, the uncanny, and particularly as Freud, but even more Freud's predecessors that he draws upon, like Schelling, defined it, which is this kind of ambiguity between animate and inanimate. And what is striking about that is I wouldn't say that's an ontology, because it's an ambiguity. It's unclear. But what I'm trying to say is that if we think about the nature, to kind of avoid the scare word of ontology, of the photographic and cinematic image, and particularly cinematic, what I'm trying to say is that it is inherently ambiguous. That if on the one hand one can say, and I don't think this is wrong, that it has this connection to realism, partly as explained by the index and by other elements of verisimilitude. What Bazin calls the photograph's irrational power to bear away our faith. We believe the photograph. We might even theoretically say we don't believe it, but we do. Tom Mitchell, my colleague, used to have a course where we talk about media, and he'd ask everybody to bring a photograph of their parents, or one of their parents, to the class. And he'd say, how many of you believe that this is really endowed with the spirit of your parents? And they'd go, well, not at all. They say, okay, now take a pin out and poke out its eyes. And everybody goes, yeah. That's, that is more than just the idea of being lexical, and I don't even know that we can totally define that. But the thing is that it has to do with the nature of the photograph rather than the nature of the uncanny. I think the nature of the uncanny is psychological rather than ontological, although, depending on the day I might change my mind on that. But my claim here is simply that the photograph, and even more the moving photograph, the animated photograph, as they used to call films at the very beginning, has, that it had this dual heritage. Partly people looked at it and went, that's real, that's amazing. That is, in fact, this phrase, this is indeed life itself. A number of critics said when they saw the Lumiere films, you know. But at the same time, you have the other one, which of course, the locus classicus, which I quote all too often, is Maxim Gorky's response to looking at the Lumiere films in Russia in 1896, in which he says, last night I was in the kingdom of shadows, you know. And he says, it's another world. It's a world without color, without sound, you know, it's a world of phantoms. So there are these simultaneous two things, and I'm talking about the nature of the cinematic image to bring up that ambiguity. Now, talking otherwise, as I say, I think we might have to talk psychologically, because almost it comes down to asking me, do I believe in ghosts? And, well, frankly, I do, but, you know, but I'm never quite sure that's an ontological question. You know, I think it's probably a psychological question about me, but also it's about the nature of human culture and time and a whole series of things. So I'm not ready to make a statement about ghostly ontology in the world, but I am saying that it is quality of the cinema. Not all films will access it, though I could claim that all films could. But some films deliberately invoke it. And, you know, obviously these are two examples. And I wouldn't even quite claim that all horror films invoke it, because a lot of horror films are just, you know, scaring you. But here it seems to me that it's doing both. Is that an answer?
Well, just to ask a quick follow-up, part of where my question was coming from was, and this might have just been a polemical thing at the beginning, because your talk is about these two films that bookend the 1920s, right? Nosferatu and The Fall of the House of Usher. But where, I mean, if you're thinking through this concept of ghostly ontologies, you know, as the man who theorized the cinema of attractions, what do you do with the earlier stuff?
It's quite interesting, because Gorky gets it right away looking at Lumiere films, which none of us think about, or very few of us would think about as ghostly films. He sees them as ghostly. When I first showed, one of the first courses I taught in Brooklyn College, you know, in the 70s, I showed the Lumiere films to, you know, it's a group of Brooklynites. And I said, well, you know, these are the first films ever made. What do they make you think of? What do you think when you see them? And I showed The Baby's Breakfast. And one of them said, all I can think is, that baby's dead now. So, in other words, I do think it potentially underlies every photographic and moving image. And I think there were enough, I mean, I actually had a section here that I cut out in the interest of time, which, when I was talking about the negative, because there is a film that the Biograph company made in 1901. You can see it on YouTube. It's called Ghost Train. One of the first genres of cinema were train films. This is one of those. It's a film of the Empire Express. But besides issuing it as a positive print, they then printed the negative and called it Ghost Train. And it is very creepy. And one of the things, film that, you know, talk about it, because yes, I do also think this theme continues. Film that I think is actually very interesting, even though it's got two of the worst performances in the history of cinema. Francis Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, which, you know, has a horrible portrayal by Keanu Reeves, which you expect, and then a horrible performance by Winona Ryder, which you don't expect, and then a lot of fun performances by Gary Oldman and so on. But there is how many people have seen it? You know, I don't know that it's that well known now. It's kind of a little bit disappeared. I know it's not available on Blu-ray. But there's a scene in it, very smart, where Dracula accosts Nina, Winona Ryder, and asks her where the cinematograph is playing. And they go to a performance of the cinematograph that is not like any one that was ever given in all of history. But they're various, mainly pornographic films are being displayed, and they're walking around. It's not in a theater, it's kind of in a kind of fairground. And suddenly at a point when Dracula is saying how much he thinks this is a triumph of science. And she turns to him and says, "Science? Do you really think it's science?" And right at that moment, Ghost Train appears on the screen behind them. And it's obviously partly a reference to Nosferatu and the use of negative there. It's a reference to, it's very smart. I mean, I have a feeling it's even smarter than whoever thought of it. You know, it's one of those moments where something happens that's excessive in intention. So yes, that's a long way to answer. I think it's there in early cinema. What the difference is, cinema of attractions is about just pure, here's display. Look at this, look at this, look at this. By the 1920s, it's think about this, think about this. You know, the 19-teens, grosso modo, the pre-teens is about look at this, then it's about let me tell you a story with this, and here it's this point, let me tell you a story, let me show you something, and let me get you to think about something. And so that would be the difference. So it is something that I don't think ever disappears. At the same time, as I say, not all films access it. But one of the things is reception can access it. Just watch an Elvis Presley film and think, he's dead. Ken Jacobs, in his very great film that he used in 1905 film, Tom Tom the Piper's Son, which he called then Tom Tom the Piper's Son as well, but in which he slows down and analyzes the film. In his program notes for it, he says, ghosts, moving light images of people long dead. So, immediately, again, that early film, Tom Tom the Piper's Son, was not about ghostly elements. But all it takes is for someone to kind of put his skeletal hand on your consciousness. There's that beautiful story that Dreyer, who of course made the greatest of all vampire films, probably Vampire, said at one point the feeling he wanted to evoke in his film was we're sitting in an ordinary room and there's a closet, and I can suddenly say, behind that closet door, there's a corpse. That room will feel different. So same way, all you have to do is perform a little bit to get the ghostly ontology of any film, I would say. I assume that goes somewhere towards answering. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning Vampire, which
Yes.
is thoroughly uncanny in a lot
Absolutely.
of ways. I was taken with your comment, especially about the skull on the cliff, which is, if I think I saw what you were saying, and if it is, it's really an anamorphic image.
Yes.
You have to kind of mentally reconstruct it, which takes me back to how far back you can go in this, not just to photography, but to the traditions of realistic painting.
Sure.
And I think it was John Berger made the claim that Holbein's The Two Ambassadors, which has this big white smush in the foreground, when you literally have to look at it from another angle to see it's a skull, and it's a traditional kind of memento mori. But his point is that realism required any notion of the uncanny, the supernatural, and whatever, for you literally to take a different view of things. And to some degree, I think what you're talking about here with the use of very cinematic techniques, like the double exposure, negative, whatever, is one way of doing that.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that. And exactly that idea of getting a stance. Which one of the things that fascinates me about the anamorphosis is, in a certain way, can be thought about as the opposite of traditional perspective. Instead of looking straight on towards the vanishing point, you get to the side. Of course, in the Tate Museum, where ambassadors is displayed, they now have this little stand at this point, and you will see the skull. But at the same time, in order to make an anamorphic figure, involves careful use of perspective. It is probably the most rational mathematical puzzle in figurative painting. So there's this amazing thing of, again, the kind of calculation that actually takes you past calculation.
The other side of that, I think, with realistic art, you have Hawthorne playing with a similar story to the Oval Portrait, one of his short stories. And then you have all of these urban legend folk tales about the camera capturing your soul.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. No, exactly. All of this is part of modern mythology. And I actually have friends who won't be photographed. I mean, they're crazy anyway, but I mean, and of course there are traditional cultures where the idea was that it steals your soul.
And there's Thomas Pynchon.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So I was wondering, watching through it and hearing what you were talking about, the first scene that came in my head was in Bergman's Persona, when Elizabeth sucks on Alma's wrist, and she cuts it when she's bleeding. So I was wondering, and that too I think speaks to a ghostly sort of ontology for cinema and for them. But I'm curious, do you think when this ontology is discovered, because I think there's an idea where if we discover ontology, somewhere truth is there. So when we discover this ghostly ontology, are we just left into this sort of void of nothingness where we can only ask more questions, or do you think it reveals something about cinema itself that has a constructive, positivist answer?
Well, I don't know if I'd say a positivist answer, although did you mean positivist or positive?
Like positive, or besides that?
I see.
You know.
Well, It's again one of those questions that goes far beyond, you know, what I'm talking about here, because you know, whether it's a good thing to be in contact with ghosts or not, I think is a real question. You know, I actually think it is good, but I'm never quite sure that I'm not violating something there. Now here I'm speaking kind of mythically and somewhat in fiction, you know, in quotes. But to go back to the Persona, you know, which is a very great film, and which is, Bergman was always said that, you know, what inspired him most was these German silent films. And of course the film he made soon after Persona, Hour of the Wolf, is an overtly vampire, and there's a guy made up like Bela Lugosi. You know, I mean, this is a theme for him. What's so interesting in Persona is the way that it relates to all these elements. They're same kind of metaphoric, a little more explicit because it's a 60s art film rather than a 20s art film. It isn't so much creating a fictional world as creating ambiguous images that are asking for interpretation. But of course, the very beginning of Persona, or very close to the beginning, the image of the child who, I think Bergman's actually said is the stillborn child that the nurse had, or the abortion, and who's reaching out for onto the photograph of I think it's of Liv Ullmann, and trying to touch it, but of course it's only a photograph. So that whole sense of what is a photograph, how do we make contact with it, is raised there. I think those are profound issues, you know. But I mean, Persona is a film about going mad and the dangers of it. So all of this is dangerous stuff, I guess I'm saying. So, but it's partly, I'm never quite sure about saying anything positive because I like negative images very much. Yeah.
So during your talk, I was a little bit confused at the relationship between the visual metaphors for parasitism and then ghosts, because I think of ghosts as being the impressions, and I mean it makes sense with the photographic process, but I mean like it doesn't necessarily then translate directly to the metaphors and the theme. And then I realized that I'd helped myself out figuring this out because I have this copy of The Intelligence of the Machine right here, and I found this quote on a page that I'd already marked. And he's actually talking about discontinuity of individual frames when played in a projector. There's nothing inherently changed about the photographic image, but so it says right here, discontinuity becomes continuity only once it has entered the movie viewer. It is purely an interior phenomenon. And then a couple sentences later, within ourselves we get an impression that, like all the other data of the senses, an interpretation of the object that is like a ghost.
No, yeah, this is obviously, well, I don't want to interrupt you.
Oh no, I'm sorry. So I mean, it's just like really strange to me that like this illusion is happening like in an interior place as if one were possessed. And then that's kind of like a shadow version, I think, of like the way that we would interpret cinema just by like watching the image on the screen, rather than thinking of it as a medium.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to confess, and this is something I think I might differ with Epstein slightly, but I think we actually mean the same thing. I'm always a little worried about the idea of something being inside. But I think as a metaphor, it's actually quite powerful, partly because it's the metaphor of the camera. You know,
Oh,
we
yeah,
are
that's
cameras.
the
We are
metaphor of
taking
the
something.
brain for the
Yeah,
camera.
but the brain is a camera. I mean, I actually resist that kind of camera obscura image of consciousness because I think it's more like we're projectors. You know, we're going out into the world rather than taking things in. But at the same time, there's an element of it that makes a lot of sense. You know, and it does have to do, I mean, if I'm understanding your connection, that idea of ingesting. You know, to me, the interior as a psyche is a problematic image, but the interior as hunger, as what the baby pulls into itself from the either the bottle or the breast, is I think really powerful, and that's partly why these images are so strong of the Venus flytrap or of the polyp absorbing, that we're actually not seeing metaphors there. I mean, they become metaphors, but we're actually seeing these scientific images. This is how nature works. And of course, what's interesting is if you see it just scientifically, it's kind of like, oh yeah, good. But then if you think they're vampires, it's really spooky. To kind of think, maybe, in another version of this, I related to a sequence from a Griffith film called The Avenging Conscience, which I think Murnau was imitating, where a character sees spiders eating flies. And he goes, nature is one long system of murder. And I think that kind of sense, but of course, the murder is also birth. I mean, I always find it interesting that on the one hand, that final image of Nosferatu Orlok nursing is horrifying, but it's also kind of sweet, almost. And of course, Werner Herzog did, I mean, this has been filmed in a constellation, in his remake of this film with Klaus Kinski, he very much recreates that composition, but he adds, because it's a sound film, and it's really eerie, because there's something, evocative of babyhood, infancy, of all the tenderness of nature, at the same time that it's death. Yes, Christoph.
Well, actually, that segues nicely with what I'm thinking about, because I sort of I want you to go back in some ways to Maggie's question, which I think is really important, about what might be the difference between the ontology of the photographic image and of animated images. And I think...
And which images?
Animation.
Yeah, okay.
And I think you're going a little quick over that division in some ways. But I think you're getting there with sucking and with fluidity. Because the photographic image is a kind of logic, is a kind of solid logic. Right? It's a logic of replication, of stable reproduction. But cinema has this kind of liquidity, plasticity, oozing, as we were talking about earlier. And all those vampiric forms of praying, it means the substance is being oozed from one being to another. So I have sort of two specific things to make you think about in the clips that you showed, and one is the theme of a certain form of telecommunication between protagonists, right? A certain form of something that is a transfer, right? Helen, but also between Roderick and Madeline, even though they're very present, there's a kind of, it's not telepathic or anything, but there's a kind of something going on. And the other thing is gravity. I'm struck by that, the segment of the film of Epstein, and that's a specific shot I've always wondered about. The brushes are about to fall. First of all, the palette stands on her knee in a magical way.
It's true.
It should fall off. And at some point, the brush starts to roll and stop. And I think, and the bell is being rung, her shawl is falling, relaxed. So there's something to do with gravity as a kind of analog to the motion that distinguishes animation from photographic image. So there you go, oozing, telecommunication, and gravitation.
Well, let me do the first part, because you're right, I did kind of go quickly past the question about photography and its ontology as opposed to animation. And it is I very much agree with what you're saying, and would kind of emphasize that, to me, always one of the limitations of the Bazin essay is that it's about the photographic image, and although he slides into cinema, he acts as though it's a natural motion rather than a transformation. And I very much agree with you that a still photograph is fixed, and that the real magical ontology that we're talking about comes with the animation. And it maybe doesn't even have to be of a photograph. You know, that in other words, it's actually this appearance of motion, and that's partly why I think it's so important that Murnau plays with stop motion and with fast motion, you know, and that Epstein plays with slow motion and freeze frame, because that kind of sense of the power of motion, you know, I mean, Knox says the blood is life, and I would say motion is life. Life is motion. And that sense of the animation of the photographic image. It's of course very interesting to think about this in relation to Bergson, who apparently thought, it's a little hard to say what he's talking about because it's kind of an analogy, but kind of said, you know, cinema doesn't give us motion because it's really just a series of still images. But of course, he had, later on, very briefly without going into it, said, well, once it's projected, it's something else. And that transformation is essential to the kind of idea of the ghostly ontology. You know, it's incomplete without it. So, you know, very much endorse what you're saying. This issue of gravity is very interesting, and I have to confess I haven't thought deeply about it. And of course, there are all these scenes in Fall of the House of Usher, which, you know, like to show the whole film, but where you're seeing all these things fall while nobody's around. You know, the armor falls, the books fall out of the bookcase, and the sense that you get in it is not just, oh, something's falling, but something's coming alive. And in fact, it is one of those uncanny moments when, you know, because I'm always piling up piles of books, you know, that are precarious, you know, I'll be sitting someplace and suddenly I hear from another room off, bang! And I immediately think, something's here, you know. It's actually just, no, you stupid guy, you know, it's gravity. But that idea of gravity as animism is I think, something very important to Epstein. Now, thinking further about it is really curious, and where I almost would be tempted to go, but I'm not prepared for it here. Poe is such an extraordinary figure, and of course he wrote poems that are great. He wrote stories that are probably greater. He also wrote this book, Eureka, which is a theory of kind of the creation of the cosmos. In other words, a scientific, metaphysic text. It's complete. You know, it can't stand up as science, but it is partly about forces of gravity. And kind of and in many ways, it's often struck me that's very similar to some things in Matter and Memory by Bergson, this kind of idea of life beginning with a kind of explosion of particles, you know, that are then always moving, you know, and that being the kind of primary moment of life. For me, that's only a metaphor, you know, I mean, even though one's tempted, and Epstein would be tempted, to relate to things like quantum physics and relativity, I'm always a little worried about that. But as a metaphor for the aesthetics, I think it's really powerful. But yeah, gravity is very, very interesting. Is there anything more you want to say about that? I mean, no, as I say, it's kind of I can see the potential of the theme, but it isn't one that I've developed myself.
Well, we can talk some more later.
Oh, good.
It has to do with the project I was telling you about. So
Yes, exactly. Well, a whole cosmology, which also is partly what's interesting with Eureka, too.
Which I will on.
Oh, interesting. Great. Yeah. Any other questions? I know we've taken a while here, but I'm willing if anyone has a final question or a final couple questions. Well, then I'll let people go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.